The evening had started like any other at the restaurant, calm and carefully controlled. Soft lights glowed from the walls, giving the place a warm and peaceful feeling. The quiet sound of cutlery, low conversations, and gentle background music filled the air. It was the kind of place where people came to relax, celebrate, or simply enjoy a moment away from the outside world. Among the staff moving gracefully between tables was a young waitress. She worked quietly, never drawing attention to herself. Her steps were light, her movements careful, and her voice always soft and respectful. She had been working there for months, yet very few people knew anything about her. She did her job well, kept her head down, and never stayed longer than needed once her shift ended. That night, she seemed no different from any other evening. She carried trays, took orders, and made sure each table was satisfied. But there was something about her that some people noticed, even if they could not explain it. It was in the way she paused for just a second near the piano in the corner, or how her fingers sometimes moved gently in the air as if remembering something. The piano itself had been there for years. It was polished, beautiful, and placed in a perfect spot where everyone could see it. Yet it was rarely used. Sometimes a hired musician would come and play for special events, but most nights, it stayed silent, almost like a forgotten piece of the room. As the evening moved forward, the restaurant slowly became busier. Well-dressed guests filled the tables, their voices blending into a soft hum. Laughter came from one corner, while quiet discussions happened in another. Everything was normal, smooth, and expected. Then, the door opened, and a man walked in who immediately changed the feeling of the room. He carried himself with confidence, the kind that came from a life of success. His clothes were neat and expensive, but it wasn't just that. It was the way people noticed him without him trying. Some guests looked up, recognizing him, while others simply felt his presence without knowing why. He was not loud or dramatic. Instead, he moved calmly, almost as if he was used to being watched. The manager quickly approached him with a welcoming smile and guided him to a table near the center of the room. The waitress noticed him like everyone else did, but only for a moment. She didn't stare or react. She simply continued her work, focused on her tasks. Still, when she was assigned to serve his table, she took a quiet breath before walking toward him. When she reached his table, she greeted him politely and handed him the menu. Her voice was steady, her expression calm. He glanced at her briefly, then nodded as he looked at the menu. At first, everything seemed normal. She took his order, answered his questions, and made sure everything was clear. But as she turned to leave, something small caught his attention. It was not something obvious. In fact, most people would have missed it. But he noticed the way her hands moved, gentle, controlled, almost careful in a way that felt familiar to him. He watched her for a few seconds longer than usual as she walked away. For the next few minutes, he sat quietly, observing the room. His eyes moved from one table to another, taking in the details around him. But again and again, his attention returned to the same waitress. She didn't laugh loudly like some of the others. She didn't rush or panic, even when things became busy. There was a calmness about her that didn't match the fast pace of her job. At one point, as she passed by the piano, she slowed down just slightly. It was only for a moment, barely noticeable. But he saw it. She didn't touch it. She didn't even look directly at it. Yet something in her movement changed, as if she was aware of it in a deeper way. That small moment stayed in his mind. When she returned with his order, he watched her again. This time, he paid closer attention. The way she placed the plates, the way she adjusted things on the table, it all felt too precise, too careful to be random. He waited until she finished placing everything before speaking. "Do you play?" he asked casually. She looked at him, slightly confused. "Play?" she repeated softly. "The piano," he said, nodding toward the corner. For a second, her expression changed. It was quick, almost hidden, but it was there. A mix of surprise and something deeper, something she quickly tried to cover. "No," she replied gently after a short pause. "Not really." Her answer was simple, but it didn't fully convince him. He leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her face for a moment. Not really, he said, a small smile forming. That sounds like maybe you do. She shook her head lightly. I haven't played in a long time. There was honesty in her voice, but also hesitation. He glanced toward the piano again, then back at her. Interesting, he said quietly. She didn't respond to that. Instead, she gave a polite nod and stepped away, continuing her work. But the conversation had already changed something. The man remained thoughtful as he ate his meal. His eyes occasionally followed her as she moved through the room. He was not staring in a rude way, but there was clear curiosity in his gaze. Meanwhile, the waitress tried to focus on her duties, but her mind was not as calm as before. The question he had asked lingered in her thoughts. It had been a long time since anyone had brought up the piano. Years, in fact. She had worked hard to move forward, to focus on what she needed to do. Life had taken her in a different direction, one where music no longer had a place. At least that's what she told herself. Yet standing in the same room with that piano, hearing someone mention it so directly, it stirred something she had kept hidden. She continued serving other tables, but her movements were slightly different now. A little more careful, a little more aware. Back at his table, the man finished his meal but didn't ask for the bill right away. Instead, he sat quietly, watching the room with a thoughtful expression. Finally, when she came back to check on him, he spoke again. If you haven't played in a long time, he said calmly, that doesn't mean you can't. She looked at him, unsure of what he meant. He nodded toward the piano once more. The room continued its usual rhythm around them. Conversations, laughter, the sound of plates, all blending together. But between them, there was a quiet moment forming, something that didn't match the rest of the evening. She hesitated, unsure how to respond. And for the first time that night, it felt like something unexpected was about to happen. She stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say next. The noise of the restaurant continued around her, but it felt distant, like it had moved a few steps away. His words stayed in her mind. That doesn't mean you can't. It sounded simple, but it carried weight she was not ready to handle. She gave a small, polite smile, the kind she used with all customers. I'm sorry, she said softly. I have work to do. It wasn't a direct answer, but it was enough to step away from the conversation. He didn't stop her this time. He simply nodded, watching her leave again. But his curiosity had only grown stronger. As she moved from table to table, she tried to push the moment aside. She focused on orders, on refilling glasses, on making sure everything stayed perfect. But something had shifted. Her mind kept drifting back to the piano, to the question, to the way he had looked at her as if he already knew something she hadn't said. At another table, a group of guests noticed her slight distraction. One of them repeated an order, and she quickly apologized, correcting herself. She rarely made mistakes like that. It bothered her more than it showed. Across the room, the man continued to watch quietly. He was not rushing, not forcing anything, but he was patient. He had seen enough people in his life to recognize when someone was hiding a part of themselves, and he was certain she was doing exactly that. After some time, he gently raised his hand to call her again. She saw him from a distance and felt a small wave of tension. Still, she walked over, keeping her calm expression in place. Yes? She asked politely. He rested his arm on the table and looked at her, not in a demanding way, but with quiet interest. You seem distracted, he said. She shook her head lightly. No, sir. Everything is fine. He gave a small smile. You don't have to pretend. She didn't reply to that. Instead, she waited, hoping he would move on to something else. But he didn't. Tell me something, he continued. If I asked you to play just one piece, nothing complicated, would you say no? Her heart skipped a beat. This time, the question was clearer. Direct. I can't, she said quickly, almost before he finished speaking. Can't? He repeated. Or won't? She took a breath, trying to stay composed. It's not part of my job, she replied. The single note hung in the air for a moment, soft but clear. It wasn't loud, yet it reached every corner of the room. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if that one sound had quietly asked everyone to pay attention. She kept her fingers resting on the keys, feeling their surface, familiar and strange at the same time. Her heart was beating faster than usual, and for a second, she wondered if people could hear it. She almost pulled her hands back, but then she didn't. Instead, she pressed another key, then another. The notes came slowly at first, spaced out, careful. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply trying to remember. Each note felt like opening a small door inside her mind, bringing back something she had left behind. A few guests leaned forward slightly, listening more closely. At first, they expected something uncertain, maybe even awkward. But there was something about the way she touched the keys that felt different. Even in those first few notes, there was control. She took a quiet breath and let her fingers move a little more freely. The notes began to connect now, forming a simple melody. It was soft, gentle, almost like a whisper, but it was steady. There was no panic in her hands anymore, only focus. Across the room, the man watched without blinking. The confident expression he had earlier was gone. In its place was something more serious, more attentive. He had expected something small, maybe even hesitant. But this felt different already. The melody grew slowly, like it was finding its way back to life. She closed her eyes for a moment. That's when everything shifted. Her fingers began to move more naturally, no longer searching, but remembering. The pauses disappeared. The hesitation faded. What had started as uncertainty began to turn into something deeper. The music became smoother, richer. The room seemed to lean into it. A couple who had been whispering earlier now sat completely still, their attention fixed on her. A waiter who had been passing by stopped near a table, holding a tray without even realizing he had paused. Even the smallest sounds, glasses, cutlery, chairs had faded away. It was just her and the piano now. And yet, everyone was part of it. She opened her eyes again, but her focus wasn't on the room. It was on the keys, on the movement of her hands, on the sound she was creating. The melody changed slightly, becoming more emotional. It was no longer just a tune. It was a feeling. Something in it spoke of quiet moments, of memories, of things that were never said out loud. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it carried weight. The kind that didn't need to shout to be heard. The man at the table shifted slightly in his seat. His attention had deepened. He was no longer watching out of curiosity. He was listening, really listening. He noticed how her posture had changed. She was no longer tense. Her shoulders were relaxed, her movements confident. It was as if she had stepped into a different version of herself. Someone who belonged there. Someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The music continued to grow, slowly building. Her fingers moved faster now, but not in a rushed way. Every note had purpose. Every movement felt controlled. There was no doubt left. She wasn't just someone who had played before. She was someone who had lived through music. A soft murmur spread through a small part of the room, quickly fading again as people realized they didn't want to miss even a second. At a table near the back, an older man adjusted his glasses, his eyes fixed on her hands. He nodded slightly, almost as if recognizing the skill in her playing. Near the front, a young couple exchanged a quick glance, surprised by what they were witnessing. The manager stood quietly near the entrance, watching with a mixture of disbelief and pride. He had seen her work for months, always quiet, always careful. He had never imagined this side of her. Back at the piano, she had completely lost track of time. The room no longer existed in the way it had before. There were no tables, no guests, no expectations. Only the music. Her hands moved with confidence now, gliding across the keys with ease. The melody rose and fell, carrying emotion in every turn. It wasn't just something learned, it was something felt. There were moments when the music became softer again, almost like a gentle pause. Then it would rise once more, stronger, fuller, drawing everyone in even deeper. The man leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. His earlier calm confidence had turned into something else entirely. Respect. He hadn't expected this. Not even close. What he had thought would be a small test had become something much bigger. And he knew it. The room stayed silent, not because anyone had asked them to, but because they didn't want to break the moment. Even the staff, who were used to moving constantly, had slowed down. Some stood near the walls, others paused between tasks. No one wanted to interrupt. It was rare. Moments like this didn't happen often, and everyone could feel it. At one point, her fingers slowed again, returning to a softer part of the melody. It felt like a breath, a quiet pause in the middle of something meaningful. Her expression remained calm, but there was emotion in her eyes now. Not sadness, not joy, but something in between. Something that came from remembering, from feeling, from letting go, even if just for a few minutes. The final part of the piece began to take shape. There was a gentle build again, not rushed, not forced, just natural. Her hands moved with complete certainty now. Every note landed exactly where it should. The music filled the room in a way that felt complete. No one was questioning anymore. No one was wondering if she could play. They already knew. They were simply waiting to see how it would end. The man sat still, his gaze steady. He had started this out of curiosity. But now, he understood something he hadn't before. This was not a performance someone gives just to prove a point. This was something real. And it was only just beginning. The music didn't stop where most people expected it to. Instead of ending softly after the last gentle phrase, it continued, growing deeper and more powerful. It was as if she had crossed a line inside herself and there was no turning back now. Her fingers moved with more confidence than ever. The soft melody she had started with slowly turned into something fuller, something that carried strength along with emotion. The sound of the piano filled every part of the restaurant, wrapping around the silence like a story being told without words. People who had been sitting comfortably before were now completely still. Some leaned forward without even realizing it. Others held their breath, waiting for the next note. Even those who didn't understand music could feel that something special was happening. The rhythm changed again, becoming slightly faster. Not rushed, but alive. Her hands moved smoothly across the keys, shifting from one part of the piano to another with ease. It was no longer careful or hesitant. It was natural. At one table, a man who had been checking his phone slowly lowered it and placed it aside. His attention had been pulled into the music without him noticing. At another table, a woman rested her hand against her chest, her eyes fixed on the pianist, clearly moved by what she was hearing. The waitress, no, not just a waitress anymore in that moment, sat straight, her shoulders relaxed, her face calm but focused. There was no sign of nervousness left. It was as if the earlier hesitation had completely disappeared. She was no longer thinking about who was watching. She was simply playing. The melody shifted again, this time becoming softer for a few seconds, like a quiet pause in the middle of a long sentence. It gave the room a moment to breathe, but just as quickly it rose again, stronger and clearer. The man who had started all of this sat silently, his eyes never leaving her hands. His expression had completely changed from the beginning of the night. There was no trace of challenge or curiosity now, only respect. He understood now that this was not something small. This was not luck or simple talent. This was years of practice, discipline, and feeling, something that couldn't be faked. The manager, standing near the side, slowly shook his head in disbelief. He had seen her work day after day, never once showing this side of herself. It made him wonder how much of a person's life could stay hidden behind a simple job. The music continued to build, reaching a point where every note felt stronger than the last. Her fingers moved faster now, but still controlled. There was no chaos in her playing, only clarity. It was like watching someone speak a language they truly understood. The sound became rich and full, filling not just the room but the space inside each listener. Some guests closed their eyes, letting the music carry them. Others watched every movement, unable to look away. Time seemed to slow down. No one checked the clock. No one thought about leaving. The entire room had become part of that moment. Then something changed again. The music softened, but not in the same way as before. This time it felt deeper, more emotional, carried a sense of memory, of something personal. The notes were slower, more thoughtful, almost like she was speaking directly through them. Her face showed a hint of that feeling now. Her eyes were open, but her focus was somewhere else, somewhere far beyond the room. It was as if she was remembering something while playing. Something important, something she had once lost. The man noticed it too. There was a difference in this part of the performance. It felt more personal, less about skill and more about truth. He leaned back slightly, taking it in. Around the room, people were completely silent. Even the smallest movements had stopped. No one wanted to interrupt what they were experiencing. A glass that had been half-raised was slowly placed back on the table without a sound. A chair that had been slightly moved stayed still. Everything waited. Her hands moved gently now, pressing the keys with care, letting each note breathe before moving to the next. It wasn't about speed anymore. It was about meaning. Then, slowly, the music began to rise again. But this time, it didn't feel like a build toward something big. It felt like a closing, a final message. Her fingers moved with quiet confidence, guiding the melody toward its end. There was no rush, no sudden change. Just a smooth, natural flow. The final notes came one by one, each softer than the last. Until finally, silence. Her hands remained on the keys for a moment longer, as if holding onto the last piece of the music. Then she slowly lifted them. The room stayed quiet. For 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. It was as if no one wanted to be the first to break the moment. Then suddenly someone began to clap. It was soft at first, just one pair of hands. Then another joined, and another. Within seconds, the entire room filled with applause. It wasn't loud in a wild way. It was strong, steady, full of respect. People stood from their seats not because they were told to, but because they felt they should. The sound of clapping echoed through the restaurant, replacing the silence that had held everyone just moments before. She sat there for a second, almost frozen, felt unreal. Slowly, she stood up from the piano. Her eyes moved across the room, seeing the people who had been watching her. Their expressions were not what she had feared. There was no judgment, no doubt, only admiration. The manager stepped forward slightly, smiling in a way he never had before. The man at the table stood up as well, clapping like everyone else. But his expression carried something more, understanding. She didn't know what to do at first. She gave a small nod, a quiet thank you without words. But inside something had changed. The part of her that had stayed hidden for so long had just been seen. And it was no longer invisible. As the applause slowly began to fade, the room returned to normal, but not completely. Something about it felt different now. Something had shifted, and everyone could feel it. The applause didn't fade all at once. It slowly softened, like waves settling after a strong push. Some people were still clapping, others were smiling, and a few simply sat there, taking in what they had just witnessed. The room felt warmer now, not because of the lights, but because something real had just happened. She stepped away from the piano carefully, almost unsure where to go next. Her hands felt light, but her chest felt full, like she had been holding something in for a long time and had finally let it out. For a moment, she thought about quietly returning to her work, picking up a tray, and continuing the night as if nothing had happened. That had always been her way. Stay quiet, stay unnoticed, move forward. But this time it wasn't that simple. Before she could take another step, the man who had asked her to play moved closer. Not quickly, not in a way that would make her uncomfortable, but with calm purpose. Up close, his expression was different from before. There was no trace of testing or curiosity now. Instead, there was respect and something deeper, something thoughtful. That was not something small, he said quietly. She looked at him, unsure how to respond. Compliments were not something she was used to, especially not like this. "Thank you," she said softly, lowering her eyes for a moment. He shook his head slightly. "No," he replied. "Thank you." That surprised her. He glanced toward the piano, then back at her. You didn't just play notes, he continued. You told a story. She stayed silent, but his words stayed with her. Around them, guests were still talking about what had just happened. Some were smiling, some were shaking their heads in disbelief. A few even looked at her again, as if trying to understand how someone like her had just done something like that. The manager approached, his face still carrying that mix of surprise and pride. I had no idea, he said, almost laughing softly. All this time, she gave a small, shy smile. I just never mentioned it. Well, he said, looking around the room, I think everyone knows now. That made her feel slightly nervous again, but also something else. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. Recognition, not for her job, but for who she really was. The man waited until the manager stepped away before speaking again. Why did you stop? He asked gently. She frowned slightly, confused. Stop playing, he said. You didn't learn that overnight. That takes years. She took a slow breath. It wasn't a question she could answer with just one sentence. I had to, she said finally. He didn't interrupt. He simply listened. There was a time, she continued, when it was everything to me. I practiced every day. I had plans, goals, things I wanted to reach. Her voice stayed calm, but there was something underneath it now. Then life changed, she added quietly. She didn't go into full detail. She didn't talk about every difficulty or every moment that led her here. But she didn't need to. The way she said it was enough. He nodded slowly, understanding more than she expected. Things don't always go the way we plan, he said. She gave a small nod in return. I needed to work, she continued. I needed something stable. And slowly, I just stopped playing. There was a short silence between them. Not uncomfortable, just real. You didn't lose it, he said after a moment. She looked at him. It was still there, he added, glancing again toward the piano. You just didn't use it. His words felt simple, but they carried truth. Around them, a few guests approached, offering kind words. Some thanked her for the music. Others simply smiled and nodded. She responded politely, still a bit overwhelmed by the attention. One older guest paused for a moment longer than the others. That was beautiful, he said sincerely. Don't let it disappear again. She didn't know what to say to that, so she simply nodded. When the small crowd around her began to clear, the man spoke again. You know, he said, people spend years trying to learn what you already have. She gave a small, uncertain smile. Maybe, she replied, but life doesn't always give you the same chances. That's true, he said, but sometimes, chances come back in different ways. She looked at him, not fully understanding what he meant yet. He paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. What if, he said slowly, this doesn't have to end here? Her heart skipped slightly. I don't mean anything complicated, he added quickly. Just think about it. Playing again. Not as something you have to do, but something you choose to do. She stayed quiet, thinking. It had been so long since she allowed herself to even consider that. Playing again. Not for survival. Not for pressure. But simply because she could. I wouldn't even know where to start, she admitted. That's okay, he said. No one starts again perfectly. She looked down at her hands. They no longer felt unsure like before. They felt ready. Around them, the restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Conversations picked up again, dishes were served, and the quiet hum of the evening came back. But something had changed. Not just in the room. In her. The manager called her name gently from across the room, reminding her of her duties. She nodded and turned slightly, ready to return to work. But before she walked away, she looked once more at the piano. It no longer felt like something distant. Felt close. Possible. She turned back to the man. Thank you, she said again, this time with more meaning. He nodded. You already had everything, he replied. You just needed a moment. She gave a small smile and stepped away. As she picked up a tray and continued her work, something about her was different. Her steps were still calm, her movements still careful. But there was a quiet confidence now, something that hadn't been there before. The night went on, but she wasn't the same person she had been at the start of it. And deep inside, she knew one thing clearly. This wasn't the end of that moment. It was the beginning of something she thought she had lost. And maybe something she was finally ready to find again. The night slowly moved forward, but for her, everything felt slightly different. The same tables were there, the same guests, the same routine, but it no longer felt like just another shift. Something inside her had quietly shifted, like a door she had kept closed for years had finally opened. She continued serving, carrying plates, refilling glasses, and responding to guests with her usual calm tone. But now people looked at her differently. Some smiled a little longer than before. A few thanked her again, not just for the service, but for the music. Even those who didn't speak still showed it in their eyes. Felt strange at first. She wasn't used to being seen like this. For so long, she had been invisible in a way, not ignored, but unnoticed beyond her role. Now that had changed, and she wasn't sure how to fully accept it yet. At one point, she passed by the piano again. This time, she didn't look away. She slowed down for a brief second and glanced at it, her expression calm, almost thoughtful. It no longer felt like something distant. Felt familiar. Later, as the crowd began to thin and some guests started leaving, the atmosphere became softer again. The busy energy of the evening slowly settled into a quieter rhythm. The man was still there. He hadn't rushed to leave after everything. Instead, he had stayed, watching the night return to normal, as if he understood that something important had happened and didn't want to walk away from it too quickly. When she finally had a moment, she walked over to his table again. "Is there anything else you need?" she asked politely. He looked up at her, a small smile on his face. "I think I've already received more than I expected tonight," he said. She gave a slight smile in return. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he reached into his pocket and placed a small card on the table, sliding it gently toward her. "This is for you," he said. She looked at the card but didn't pick it up immediately. "What is it?" she asked. "Just a contact," he replied. "Someone I know. He works with music, training, performances, small events. Nothing too big or overwhelming." She hesitated. "I'm not saying you have to do anything," he added quickly. "It's just an option. If you ever decide you want to try again." She slowly picked up the card, looking at it quietly. Felt simple, but it also felt like a door. "I don't know if I'm ready," she admitted. "That's fine," he said. "You don't have to decide today." She nodded, still holding the card. He stood up from his seat then, adjusting his coat. "But I will say one thing," he added. She looked at him. "Don't wait too long," he said gently. "Some things fade if we leave them untouched." His words were not forceful, not heavy, but they stayed with her. "Thank you," she said softly. He gave a small nod and turned to leave. As he walked toward the exit, a few people glanced at him, but his presence didn't feel as strong as it had earlier in the night. The attention had shifted. Now it was on her. She watched him leave, then looked down at the card again. Her fingers held it carefully, as if it carried more than just a name and a number. The rest of the night passed quietly. The final guests left, chairs were adjusted, and the staff began their closing routine. The lights were dimmed slightly, and the once busy restaurant became calm again. She helped clean the tables, moving through the space she knew so well. But her thoughts were somewhere else. When everything was nearly done, she found herself standing near the piano again. No one was watching this time. No guests, no pressure, just silence. She looked at it for a long moment. Then slowly she stepped closer. Her hand reached out, gently touching the surface. It felt cool and smooth beneath her fingers. She pulled out the chair and sat down just like before. But this time it was different. There was no fear, no expectation. She placed her hands on the keys again. For a second she paused. Then she played a few soft notes. They sounded just as clear as before. She smiled slightly, not for anyone else, just for herself. It wasn't a full piece this time. Just a few simple notes, quiet and personal. But it was enough. Enough to remind her that it was still there. That it had always been there. She stopped after a moment, letting the silence return. Then she stood up, picking up her bag and heading toward the exit. Outside, the air felt cool and fresh. The night was calm, with only a few distant sounds from the street. She walked slowly, holding the card in her hand. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to think about the future in a different way. Not just about work. Not just about getting through each day. But about something more. Something she had once dreamed of. She didn't have all the answers yet. She didn't know exactly what she would do next. But she knew one thing clearly. She wasn't going to ignore that part of herself anymore. As she reached the end of the street, she stopped for a moment and looked up. The world felt the same. But she didn't. And sometimes that was where change truly began. She took a deep breath, a small but steady smile forming on her face. Then she continued walking forward. Not just toward home, but toward something she was finally ready to face again.